years. So let's take a moment to acknowledge the homeland of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat. This is our bi-weekly broadcast of Indigenous Insights, and today we're back again with our Indigenous. Doe.
Thank you.
We're looking forward today to talking to you a little bit about how we bring a bit of our own personality into the work that we do here at the Royal Ontario Museums, because we look at the what museum culture calls artifacts. We've actually adopted ancestral objects as the way that we refer to that. And can you tell us a little bit about why we would call these ancestral objects instead of just artifacts?
Well, we're still part of a living culture, and we are connected. We believe in, a lot of our different cultures believe in this idea of connection.
Yes.
And that it's not just, we're connected in this room right now.
Yes.
We're connected through the past and the future at the same time. And so we think about, if we look at the Anishinaabe teachings, 7 generations behind, 7 generations ahead, we actually think of our ancestors as living connection with us through our own lives. And so when we're looking at ancestral objects that have been collected in the 1800s, let's say, which a lot of them were collected during that time period, those are our ancestors and they were their objects. And so it's more acknowledging that we are a part of a living culture and it's still a part of our lives.
I had an elder also explain to me that these ancestral objects were made for the unborn. They were made with intention because they're imbued with oral knowledge and information on how to live a good life in different ways to help us live that good life to function, and as such that we want to remember that they're still living. And even though we might see a date when we see labels that talk about how old these objects are, and we're unborn, it's like, oh, it was made for me, yes, and for the unborn to come. So it's about a continuum of relationships. So
yeah, it's true. And some of the objects, some of the ancestral objects in the gallery were certainly made during those times.
Yes.
What I've brought here today are actually, some of them are archaeological, some of them are ancestral objects, but some of them are replicas. And so what we have here are a combination of all those things that we use in the learning department when we're teaching schools. So the ROM has school visits, and so during the school year, between September and the end of June, we have classes that come in and they do lessons that are related to curriculum. And so we don't say they're getting a tour of the ROM, we say that we're actually giving you a lesson and I'm your teacher right now. And so as an Indigenous Knowledge Resource teacher, also part of the school visits programming, I've learned where I needed to infuse those lessons with Indigenous perspective and Indigenous knowledge, because they weren't always obvious, And we know that the curriculum changed in 2013 in Ontario to include more Indigenous knowledge about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in particular ways.
Yeah.
But teachers who grew up in this educational system may not necessarily know how to do that, right? Because they didn't have it either when they were growing up. And so a lot of school boards have been doing education with their teachers in their PA days and such, so that they can gain that knowledge to do that. But a lot of the teachers take advantage of the ROM to teach those lessons so that it can help them, inspire them, or complement the work that they're already doing in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And I think half the fun when you put some of these objects down as we got ready is going, what is that?
That's right.
And I think that's one of the things I love about this work is that it's, for me, I stay in a constant state of learning. And while we might have labels for a lot of these objects, whether that's in our gallery or even some notes taken, I think as Indigenous peoples, we're mindful that they're incomplete. We might have measurements, which is a way of understanding an object or what it's made out of. But I think one of the things I like about the work we do is then we are able to actually tell a little more story and have a little more deep end conversation with insights that we might not otherwise see in labels that would be made by mainstream curators.
That's right, and we can assume that people who don't and have not studied or have not lived within Indigenous cultures will know what these objects are about. And so I've been in classrooms with some teachers who assume they know what these are about, and they don't, and they actually have spoken about them incorrectly. And it's not their fault, it's that they were given misinformation. And so it's kind of a delicate balance of trying to, hey, you know, this is actually what it's about, and this is the teaching around that. So it's been an interesting couple of years for me, and I really enjoy infusing that Indigenous knowledge into these classes. So I teach a number of lessons. The one that I get most often are the two are First Nations Europeans, which is a grade 5 topic, and the New France and British North America, which is grade 7 topic. And that topic is jam-packed with history, and it's between 1750 and 1814, let's say, that it basically, that lesson ends with the War of 1812. There's a lot of battles in there, there's a lot of wartime in there, includes the 7 Years' War, a little bit touching on the American Revolution, the impact of the Loyalists, but also the War of 1812.
Yeah.
And when I've seen that lesson being done, it's from a very settler perspective. And so I noticed one of the students asked, well, the question, I forget what the question was, but it implied that who were the settlers enemies with, or the settlers were enemies with the native people. That was how it was put, and I was like, no, at the time in the 1700s, that's not how it worked. There were actually strong alliances between different First Nations group and different settlers, and so I like to problematize that and tease that out. And so I'm just gonna come up and show you a map. So I'm gonna come closer, and Sharon can let me know, my awesome videographer, if they can see that or not. A little bit closer. Okay, so if you see in here, this is the map of New France in 1750. I know you didn't think you were gonna get a history lesson, right? But you see all the blue here, that's all New France. That's a huge amount of territory. And then you see British North America, which is the 13 colonies, is just right here. Then the Treaty of Utrecht, the HBC, so the British had access to Hudson Bay lowlands. But this is huge, and so I emphasize the different First Nation groups that belonged in there and was their traditional territory, and the ones along here too, that they developed relationships with the French here, and they developed relationships with the English. And that had long-standing consequences for those alliances and where people ended up. And whether that's in Canada, whether that is in what is now the United States, and the importance of those First Nations group alliances, especially during the War of 1812. You know, we might all be part of the United States if they didn't have those alliances and they won those very particular battles, you know? So I love that lesson because they're not getting those stories within their textbooks as much, right? And so that's one of the ways that we have used that knowledge. And then I try and incorporate too the story of the two Royal Wampum between the Dutch and the Five Nations Confederacy at the time in 1613. And then that gives a good introduction into talking about the treaty belts and the wampum belts. So this is a replica, this is an imitation. It's made with imitation wampum beads. I'm actually trying to make one with imitation wampum beads just to have in this lesson, because each of our lessons includes a gallery tour and then a lab component where we're in a classroom, students can touch these items, and we try and tease apart and guess what they are. But in the New France and British North America, it's very settler heavy in the lab, and so I want to help create items that will complement that history from our perspectives, or our friends' perspectives. Because I'm not Five Nations Confederacy or Six Nations as it is now since 1700. So anyway, some of these other items. Oh, you wanted to?
Yeah, I was just thinking what stands out is how stories surface sometimes when we look at something. So if I can talk a little bit about this.
Sure.
I see a spile,
Yeah.
which is something that is an innovation that gets poked into a maple tree.
Yeah. Can I
I
put
don't
that
know
closer
much.
to?
Yeah. So, to be honest, I learned about that on the Hunger Games, which is which is also a really playful way to hook your student audience, right? If you can make sometimes references to pop culture, but then we bring it back in time. And I remember once, and it was a story I heard in passing, but it talked about how Indigenous people observe nature, and how this one little girl was observing this squirrel just go back and forth between this maple tree, and just was making a really big fuss around this maple tree, and that something was coming out of the maple tree, and it got her so excited she ran home and told her mom. And what's exciting, I think, about the way Indigenous people interact across generations is that you don't have to be older to always know more, or to have something of interest to share. So this mother took on her daughter's curiosity with the same enthusiasm, and they went back and both of them observed what was going on with this squirrel. And it turns out the squirrel was boring a hole and allowing things to flow, and it invited that family to learn about tapping trees. So they learned that, and I can't confirm who told me that story or what nation it was. It was an oral exchange, but it was a really playful way to sort of add, like one of the anecdotes that I talk about all the time is that Indigenous people don't worship nature. We observe nature and do our best to repeat what we can in what we observe. So that's what stood out.
Yeah, I love that story. We'll have to do a little bit of research, and if anybody else knows out there which nation that story comes from, if you can share that with us. But we're gonna try and figure that out and know that. I hadn't heard that version either. I know a couple other stories about how First Nations groups, and different groups too, like there's a Mohawk story, an Anishinaabe story about how that was figured out. Not going to tell that now because we have other things to talk about, but it's important that we figure out where that came from.
Yes.
So yes, that's for tapping maple trees, and that's an important part of the First Nations and Europeans lesson in grade 5. Because there were two major economies that were really important. The fur trade that we talk about a lot in that lesson, but the maple trade was really huge too, because that was a huge economy, which is still a huge economy. Ask anyone in Quebec, right? Okay, so some of these other items then, they speak to tools and innovation and First Nations people as using the environment and observing that environment, but also using the tools that are available. So this is a very simple box, nice round box. And so when we're engaging with students, we would ask, what are the materials used in making this box? You know, you can lift the lid up, you can see how it's actually constructed. And this isn't ancestral logic from long ago. This is something that's modern. That has been made, somebody purchased it somewhere. But you can see some of the decoration has come off. But there are 3 main materials, thank you, that are used in here. And so I know we can't play guessing games on here because of our time restrictions, but we often will ask the students what materials are in here, what do you see? And what are the materials? And so we have to engage with them. We make them guess. Have you seen this before? That kind of thing. So there's birch bark, there's sweetgrass, and there's porcupine quills. And there is thread here too, but that's not one of the materials that we're trying to point out. And so porcupine quills were often used as decoration for boxes, for clothes, for other materials, and sweetgrass as one of the medicines, but it just smells really good and it makes a nice trim. A lot of these boxes and birch bark work will use sweetgrass as well. And then we just talk about the versatility of birch bark. During the lessons, especially that lesson, we always talk about the canoes, and we make a big stop at the beautiful canoe in the First Peoples Gallery. If you're in Toronto this summer, I highly recommend you come to the gallery and just to see that canoe. It's made in 1971 by Cesar Noashish, and if you want to, there's a National Film Board movie of him actually constructing that with his wife. And the First Peoples Gallery is free, so come on by, come and look at that canoe and just see how magnificent and huge it is. So some of the other items in here then, which I really like to connect to because they're related to my people. And so my mother's from up north, as I don't know if you've seen me in the videos before, but I'm Swampy Cree and from Northern Ontario. So these items, these two for sure, but this is a related item. Not sure where this particular one was coming from, but it is something that would have been used as well. And so let's talk about this, and I'll bring this up. So I would ask students what they think this is made out of, what it looks like. Sometimes it's lying like this, and they're like, it's a chipmunk, you know, they say, kids say the darndest things, it's true. And we finally get to, it is a bird, right? And in particular, it is a goose. And so this is a tourist-sized version of what this used to be used for, and it would be used as a decoy. When you buy these from someone who just made it, it smells really good, because tamarack branches, when they're fresh, typically these are going to be harvested and made in the fall. They smell really good, and so this one not so bad.
Can you bring the smell back by wetting it or
Yeah, you can soak it, and it'll never be as strong as the first time, but yeah, you can soak it and dust it off, but there's a little dusty smell. A little bit left, but this would have been used, like a life-size version of a goose would have been used as a decoy, because the goose hunt is really important still up in the subarctic, all across Canada. First Nations people and Inuit people still hunt and eat goose, and so getting them to land where you want was really important, and so having decoys.
I think one of my favorite, I grew up in British Columbia where geese are almost like pets because they are just everywhere. They come visit, right? We don't see them as food source, but I was there with somebody from Innu from James Bay, from a place called Mistissini, and he was sitting in the park with me, and he said, I wish I had my rifle.
I know,
So
right?
he really looked at the goose in a different way, but it was so funny because it sort of disrupted my urban sensibility of this really calm presence, right, that we see all the time, but it's perspective, right? He had a perspective as a food source, and we had a big chuckle.
Yeah, you know, I grew up in Moosonee, and until I was 12 years old, so as a child, we saw geese flying over the spring, and we saw seagulls because we were by James Bay, and I remember coming to visit my aunt in Toronto when I was small, maybe 8 years old, and then going back to Moosonee, and then the seagulls were there, and the seagulls had been here, and I'm like, how did they ever find Moosonee? It's in the middle of nowhere, it's so far, thinking that they were the same animals. But anyway, if we go to the last item, so this is something that's kind of really interesting to tease out of the children in terms of what they think this item is and what it would be used for, because it's not obvious, right? And so this is a tool, and so I don't. Do you know what this is?
I recognize it as a tool to fix nets, fish nets.
That's right. So she's from the West Coast, so that makes sense.
We have similar tools,
right? And so this is a gill net shuttle, and so it's a weaving tool. It's a weaving tool to make nets for fishing. But trying to get students to figure that out is usually a lot of fun.
Yes.
Because it doesn't really look like anything like that. And unless you're crafty, like you're a knitter or something, it takes them a long time to get there, and I'm no mercy. I kind of give them clues, but I make them guess, and that's a lot of the fun. And this is a related tool that goes with that. So
makes me wonder if it's like a buoy or some type of mini anchor.
So you see it's a stone, and there's been holes that have been drilled in there, and you're exactly right. And so these nets would need to be buoyed down, and this is the weight that would hold the net to the bottom of the river or wherever you wanted them to be. And so getting them to figure that out takes a long time too.
Well, I could
and that's a lot of fun. I know. And I gave the hint really soon because we're limited on time in terms of our broadcast, but usually we separate them first.
Yes.
Like they're not at the same table. And then we go, well, okay, what if I told you these two were related? And then they're like, oh, you know, and so we try and make the labs as interactive as possible so that they come up with the solutions and they figure it out. Because you'll just remember things better that way. and someone just giving you information all the time. This is what this is for, this is what this is for. So this is just an example of those things. And talking about First Nations innovations and use of the environment and the biodegradable nature of these tools and stuff, you can bring in a lot of ideas about stewardship, environmental concerns, and how these practices were actually good for the environment, and still they could still be good in that way. Yeah.
When I walk by the hunting case in First Peoples Gallery, I often point out, I don't see an extension cord in sight. What does that represent? Like, I don't see anything that would require electricity. And it goes back to me, or it goes back to knowing that when we harvest to sustain our needs, not over harvest. And so we don't need anything super big than what would take care of our own personal needs or our family's needs.
Right.
And if you have multiple versions of objects to sort of reflect harvesting for more people, I think over harvesting is something that came from the introduction of capitalism and that exchange, right? So I think what's nice about seeing the hunting case is that it shows how those hunting tools and traps and innovations withstand time.
Yes.
Because they don't need extension cord. You're not reliant on electricity or an external source.
That's right.
Harvesting from nature itself.
Yes, so she said the big word, capitalism, right? And so from a lot of First Nations perspectives in terms of how we live, it's more about stewardship, which is a totally different way of thinking. And so trying to bring that into our lessons, it's a natural thing for us to do.
Yes.
And so I take that as a huge responsibility to bring that forward to this generation. And so I feel very blessed and very lucky to have this work and to be able to do that, because I see the change sometimes that it's making even in a lesson, and so that's a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, thanks for really helping our team, as part of a member of our team, to really breathe life into the ancestral objects with stories that maybe our guests might not hear in a mainstream setting otherwise. So it's really lovely to have Indigenous members of our team to help show a much bigger picture. So thanks again for coming in today and picking the ancestors for us to choose. We'll be back again on August 22nd. We hope you tune in to Indigenous Insights. If you haven't been to the museum in a while, Doe mentioned that the First Peoples Gallery is free year-round, Monday to Friday. We have Indigenous Knowledge Resource teachers like Doe herself who'll be in there. So if you haven't got anything to do today, come on down and visit Doe and get to know a little more about the ancestral objects that make up the First Peoples Gallery. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Cheers.